So thank you all for joining our webinar here, for our April webinar. Glad you could all join us today. We're focused today around the whole question of how do we scale and solidify an OT security or reliability management program, and how do we think about leveraging resources, both internal as well as managed services type resources from third parties. We'll be talking about the concept of how to do this broadly, meaning, what are the principles you want to think about when thinking about engaging both your internal organization as well as third parties in the program. We'll talk a little bit about how Verve does this today, but hopefully you can use this as a sort of a best practices, whether you use Verve or other providers, as to how to think about this question. So with that, I'd like to welcome you. My name is John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve. Verve is part of Rockwell Automation now as of November, and I'll talk about that in a second. I spent the first 20 years or so of my career with a consulting firm called McKinsey & Company, where I was doing a lot of work on digital transformations, connectivity in mobile connectivity of a range of different types. And in the last 7 or 8 years, I've been the CEO here at Verve. And joining me today, I'm excited about it, Justin Jackson. Justin is our manager of technical services, helping our clients actually implement these managed services in their environments, particularly around data reliability. And he's going to talk a little bit more as we go forward here today about some of the experiences we've had in taking an organization from a very low level of data reliability and increasing that over time. And I'll talk about what we mean by that in a bit. Who is Verve? Why are we doing this webinar? So Verve's been in business for now our 31st year in business. It started as a company doing industrial controls engineering and services type work. And then 15, 16 years ago, the company built the first version of what we now call the Verve Security Center, which is a software platform that's vendor agnostic. It can operate in any type of OT environment to allow our customers to have full visibility on the security and, frankly, the reliability of that environment. We've also been doing OT, what we call OT systems management, for roughly that same 15, 16, 17 years, and to help our clients integrate the various elements they need to conduct to both secure their environments, as well as to ensure the data flows that are so critical to operating an industrial environment. In the end of last year, we combined forces with Rockwell Automation and merged into Rockwell as a core element of their overall security offering. Most of you probably know who Rockwell is. They've been around for 120 years or so, providing all sorts of industrial control system elements, including a wide range of cybersecurity services to their clients as well. So a quick summary of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to have 3 basic sections. First, we're going to talk a little bit about why this is so important and what are the challenges around it. So obviously, data security is becoming a bigger issue with threats and attacks and vulnerabilities in software, et cetera. But reliability is also becoming a bigger issue. When we say data reliability, we really mean the ability to take data out of OT systems and analyze it and then take actions as a result of it, whether that be through historians, through IoT data sources, et cetera. And as more and more we are reliant on those analytics to run these businesses, that data reliability becomes a very, very key element of what we do. Secondly, then, what we have found is that success requires really an integrated approach to bringing security and reliability to these environments. If we think about the IT world, where there have been 25 years of investments and processes built around ITIL and other IT systems management standards, OT has not really followed that same journey. And so we have, and in IT, we have a series of silos that have been developed. and by the way, not silo, not in a bad way necessarily, but there's a group that focuses on configuration. There's a group that focuses on networking. Another group that might focus on patching. Within OT, our strong view is we really need to think about this in an integrated way, and all of those pieces coming together. First of all, we don't have the resources, but secondly, we have to build those processes that have been a little less robust than have been built over 25 years in the IT side. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how an OT systems management program, particularly leveraging third parties from a managed services point of view, can really help improve the security and drive efficiency over the overall security program. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the sort of the best practices and learnings we've had in that journey. So with that, I'll dive in. So to set the stage, what do we see going on, right? As we talk to organizations really around the world about their OT landscape, we're seeing this air raid occurring. And the air raid has both an external as well as an internal impact or risk. So the first is the attackers, right? The external attackers. OT is becoming a greater target for commercial hackers. So if you look sort of 5 years ago, nation states were the largest threat actor as surveys came back and data came back from threats. In today's world, the number one risk and threat is ransomware, which is largely driven by more of I'll call it a commercial hacker, more of a for-profit group who's trying to shut you down and generate earnings as a result of that. And they know that OT systems are so critical that if they can shut them down, likely people are going to pay. The second part of that air raid is IT, and this is obviously an internal piece. IT is connecting more and more to OT, and as it does that, it opens the door to those risks that have been somewhat separated from the OT environments. Next, regulation. Two broad categories here. So one is both around compliance. One is the regulatory compliance around security, things like the NIS2 framework in Europe or things like TSA pipeline regulations here in the United States. But the other is compliance around things like environment, et cetera, where the data that you have in your systems needs to be brought out on a real-time, regular basis for reporting on things like your SEMS and that you're not producing environmental impact in the environment. And so as we think about these regulatory requirements, it's increasing the amount of work and effort for security while also increasing the importance and criticality of that data reliability process. Resource constraints are across the board, increasing retirements, lack of experienced folks in the OT security realm, increasing access. So opening up the spigot more and more to access both to get data out, but now more and more to control remotely, right? Cloud-based control systems. Most of the wind farms that we see, the OEM vendors have two-way communication to tune those turbines. Insurers. So insurers are becoming a much, much bigger impact on OT security. If you go back 2 or 3 years and you were buying cyber insurance, you really didn't talk about OT. Today, in almost every cyber insurance policy for an industrial company, there is an entire element of that needs to be filled out around what you're doing in OT. And then finally, data. The amount of data that we are requiring to run these operations, and as we think about moving to a more AI kind of driven environment, the data is exploding. And as a result of that, data uptime becomes critical. I can't run my plant if I'm not at 5 nines reliability on the data, because it is what's driving the decisions. So these variety of things are coming together to create an urgency around improving our security and reliability of the data in OT, but also creating challenges in that process. The most fundamental challenge that we hear as we start this is, what do I got? I have been operating this facility for 30 years. Stuff's been put in cabinets. We will often find as we do our discovery with our software, there's a device and no one knows where the device is. It's literally in the rafters or something. And so the first question is, what do I have? And organizations have tried different things, right? They might have tried a network tap approach where they're monitoring network traffic through switches. That gets them some visibility. They can then maybe infer some things from that traffic. But what they really need is they got to get down deep, right? You got to get down to the bottom of the ocean, so to speak, about what's there. And not just what the asset is, but also the information about that asset. So what are the user accounts on that device? When was the password last changed? What are the various network shares that that device has? If it's a Windows device, does it have antivirus on it? Is it up to date? Essentially a deep view of the assets. That's usually the first challenge that we see organizations face. And there needs to be some way to get, through backplanes and into the IO, et cetera. So challenge number one. In addition, the second challenge around the data has really grown. So because of the needs for real-time data, obviously this is critical. But what happens is that the systems weren't necessarily built to have that reliability. So the source device may go down. You might get network device errors, and so the traffic's not moving through as it should be. There may be communication gaps for one reason or another. You get the data up, but somehow it got corrupted in the process. From a security point of view, we have the risk of man-in-the-middle attacks, and so is that data that you're getting actually the data that come off the device? In the security world, we have this we call the CIA triad, right? Which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is really an integrity question, right? How good is that data when it shows up? We have lack of dedicated personnel, and then one of the most important parts is typically there's just no tracking of data reliability. It's not something that we have historically monitored for, yet we're reliant now on it to run our operations. As we think about security, right? So once we know what assets we have, a typical environment will have literally thousands of high or critical vulnerabilities. This is not abnormal. In some ways, it's not unexpected, right? People haven't been patching these systems on a regular basis. And so we have a world with very little understanding of what's there. And then once it shows up, wow, this is a lot to do to be able to remediate these vulnerabilities. And in many cases, to make matters worse, there's actually no patch available. So this is just one example, right? But this particular ICS advisory comes out from us, from Rockwell, but the device has been discontinued. So there's really no patch for it. You either have to replace the device, or there's a variety of compensating controls you can take for that risk. But that just adds to the complexity of these environments because these devices are old. In many environments, we see maybe 50% or more of the devices are being end of life, and therefore there's no specific patch. And then even if you find that there's a patch, we have to go through the compatibility checks because these systems have been put in over time. And so if I update the firmware on one device, do I have to update it elsewhere? Does that work with the version of application software that I'm running, et cetera? And so the complexity of dealing with these vulnerabilities is significant. And at the end of the day, we don't have the bodies to do it, right? So this is survey data, and it is literally the same every year, that the number one challenge that people have is expertise and personnel. It's hard to find people, and we see this all the time. Organizations will hire someone, or maybe hire 2 or 3 people. Let's say you hire 3 people. And within a year, one of those people has been promoted, one of those people has been hired to a different part of the organization, and maybe one didn't work out. And the next thing you know, you're back to zero again, and you're trying to train again. And so this resource challenge in the world of security is becoming a huge problem. And there's no processes, right? We haven't built the processes for OT security like we have in IT security, and so or data reliability. And so at the beginning, we just have to start building those procedures and policies. So that's the challenge. So now as we get into some of the things we do about it, we really believe in this integrated approach, and we'll talk through some of the key success factors we've seen here. So the first is As we think about building a team to do this, whether that team be internal or external, the question arises, well, who do we need? What types of people do we need? And so as we start this, we start to focus around the cybersecurity side. There are roughly 1 million or so people employed in the cybersecurity industry in the United States. And this is a United States picture, but it would be very similar representative for the rest of the world. And NIST keeps a database of cybersecurity jobs that are filled and that are open. So there's about 1 million that are filled, and there is about 450,000 that are open. And when you dive into that database of what are the skills, what are the jobs that are there, and what are the skills required, CyberSeek does this great thing of breaking it down by skill set. And what you find is that, ballpark is 75, 80% of the jobs are related to what would be referred to as systems management. These are things like patch management or configuration management or network device provisioning. These are things that you're doing on a constant basis, right? You're always updating patches, you're updating new device provisioning, configurations, et cetera. And on the bottom, you see that about 15% or so of the jobs are related to the more analytical part of things. And what I mean by that is things like, a SOC analyst or predictive, all the AI stuff or forensics, et cetera. By the way, important jobs. But as we think about scale, where are we going to need the people? We really need to focus on those systems management capacity, because that's where the volume of activity is and the volume of jobs are. And so the first, key success factor is identify the tasks and the skills that you need to fill and start to fill those, whether those be internal or external. The next point, and I highlighted this at the beginning, the integrated notion of this. In an OT environment, because many cases we can't solve the problem in a rifle shot way. So in IT, right, we get a bunch of patches, great, let's go patch stuff. No, an OT doesn't work that way, as we all know, right? The patch may not be approved by our vendor. It may not be compatible with other assets that we have. Frankly, we may not have downtime to deploy the patch. So that's just one example. So we have to think about other compensating controls to work on. So these functions need to work very, very closely together. Those various elements at the top of that page, the systems management functions, need to work really closely together in an OT environment. Whether that be vulnerability management, we see insecure configurations. All right, who's going to harden that config? And is that a way to address a risk rather than patching? Do we have user and accounts that are insecurely managed? And how do those interrelate with the vulnerabilities and the patches that I might need to deploy? So our strong view is, as we think about a team, whether, again, this be external or internal, that team needs to bring together these different pieces. All assets may not be equally critical. So that team needs to understand which are the ones that are important, which are not. And then prioritize where we're going to spend our time around different controls, different needs for recovery, et cetera. And so this integrated notion of managed services or internal teams is absolutely critical in our view. And by the way, this goes back to that procedural point. In many cases, when we start working with a client in helping them through this journey, they don't have procedures for this stuff. There's no processes set up. So one of the first pieces of this is just setting up these integrated processes to get going. And we're going to talk about this idea of local versus central. What do you do at the plant versus what can you do centrally? But not only do those pieces need to integrate around that circle, but they also need to integrate across the local teams at the plant, but also your central security teams. And so as we think about a managed services team or an internal team securing your environments, making sure that the analysts at the top, whether that be a SOC analyst, a vulnerability analyst, et cetera, are working very closely with the local teams, because obviously you don't want to push patches in an OT environment from 2,000 miles away. So how do those teams work together? Bringing that group, those teams together is key in our view of making this work. And then another cycle, which comes in the detection part of it, right? So we also believe that integrating the detection part of what you're doing, so a threat detection, with the response is critical. So we've been, in situations where an organization has an IT SOC, let's say, and they're sending logs up to that SOC, and there's an alert. Something's happened. Some threat has been identified. And what often happens is that results in a phone call to somebody at the plant who has no data, has no visibility into that data set that the SOC analyst uses. And then there's a question of, all right, so what are we going to do? Should we shut down the plant? Is there a system we should take offline? Was there really anything going on in the first place? And so again, our view is if you're going to have a team of folks internally or a managed services team, that team needs to work together, seeing the risk, identifying what's really going on, and then making a recommended response. Because in most cases, and then maybe even taking that action, whether that be shutting down a service, patching a vulnerability, whatever it happens to be, because in that circle, we're not then trying to call a plant and ask, well, what should we do? Because that plant is manager or technician or whatever is probably not going to know at that point. So again, integrate these pieces together, we think is critical. Okay, so how do we do that? Right? What are the ways we've seen people do that? And also, what are some examples of how it actually works in practice? So the rest of the time today, we're going to talk about how do you build the procedures to make this work? Where do you focus those teams' energies? What are the impact if you do it right in making this happen? And by the way, if people have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. Happy to, we'll address a bunch of questions at the end as well. So how have we thought about this at Rockwell? So as I mentioned, Verve merged with Rockwell back in November, and Verve had already been doing a wide range of services for our clients. We are a technology company, like Rockwell is a technology company, but in the OT world, we recognize that technology alone is not going to solve this problem. And so we had been offering clients a wide range of OT systems and security managed services. Rockwell too had been offering that. And so we're bringing those pieces together. And back to this point around integration, we have seen this machine work very well when we put each of these pieces into the machine. So let's start at the kind of the 1 o'clock there with the tech-enabled assessment. In most cases, we find that starting with that tech-enabled assessment is the way to get going in the right direction. What this means is using a platform, in our case, we use Verve for this, a platform to gather that deep asset data and identify risks and score those risks, et cetera, and then assess all the sites so that you really understand, A, where your security risks are, and B, where your data risks are from a reliability point of view, and really have a strong picture using technology, so it's real hard data, not survey data, to do that. Then building a roadmap. So that services team is going to help an organization take that data and translate it into specific actions that can be accomplished in improving the reliability or security of the environments. Next is, in almost every case, there is some deployment required of technology to improve that performance. That could be our Verve technology, but it also could be backup solutions. It could be application whitelisting. It could be network analysis tools. Next is then actually hardening the systems. So, and this is kind of typically, there's a one-time piece of work that has to happen to do this. And in that, again, back to the integration point, we need to think hard about, all right, I'm going to patch this, but maybe I can't patch that. So what else am I going to do to harden that device? That team also helps with network segmentation, because to know how you want to segment your network, you really got to know what's in it. You got to know what your risks are. So you don't want to just jump in head first to network segmentation without having thought about these other pieces of the puzzle. Similarly, on an ongoing basis, being able to do ongoing patch management, vulnerability management, et cetera, of that system, knowing what the risks are. Then what we call OT systems management, and Justin's going to talk about that in a minute, but the idea of maintaining those systems. So think of your data historians, right? Making sure that data is getting from that end device to where it needs to get to in a consistent, regular, quality manner. Making sure that your industrial data center, your servers and switches at kind of level 3.5, are operating as expected. And then OT systems monitoring. So in a real-time basis, monitoring threats, monitoring activity in the environment that might be a risk, and then responding. So as I showed that integrated circle, going from a detection to a response action in an integrated way. We think a strong suggestion is, as you think about partnering with either a service provider, or if you're bringing teams together to do this internally, you can do it all internally. Thinking about this machine and how it's all going to work together is absolutely critical. As I said before, we go into organizations, there are no processes for this, right? It hasn't been set up. And so one of the first things we're doing is we're building this machine, right? We're gonna design how these pieces are going to work together. And when you do that, you want to have an integrated services team that can help pull the pieces together. That's been our experience of success. So, as I mentioned, we think about this across these three phases. We assess first, so that's that tech-enabled assessment, road mapping exercises. We then do, typically there's a one-time remediation exercise, and that's things like network segmentation, patching initially, fixing data traffic that has fallen apart, building a virtualized environment, should that be required, et cetera. And then there's the ongoing maintenance. Typically, when we hear clients, organizations talk about managed services, they tend to focus on this back end, right? It tends to jump to a SOC. Oh, yeah, managed services, that equals SOC. In our view, we are strong proponents of pulling these pieces together. So by the time you get to the end and you're maintaining it, you actually have that team with deep understanding of what the assessment was and what the initial remediations were. And then, yes, you want to be ongoing monitoring for threats, et cetera, but you also want to be ongoing monitoring for risks, new vulnerabilities, new patches that need to be adjusted, monitoring your data flows to make sure they're, getting the 5.9 reliability you need, and then obviously responding to any threats or breakdowns in the system. But if when we hear people say, oh yeah, we need help in managed services, and it's about a SOC, our strong view is, okay, great. Yes, that probably is a need, but don't think about that as a silo. Think about how that's going to fit into an overall program. And part of the reason for this is that while you would love to say that OT security can be solved with one silver bullet, the reality is that even with Verve, that's the platform that's here in the middle. I mean, we're doing asset visibility, we're doing vulnerability management, patch management, et cetera. All great, right? It's a core element, and it's a platform that can bring other pieces together. But there are going to be other elements of your, whether it be your IT stack, like ServiceNow, it's got to be integrated with ServiceNow, or your firewalls, it's got to be integrated with your Cisco or your Fortinet. It's got to be integrated with your chosen backup solution, whatever that may be. You've got data centers you want to integrate it with. You've got, corporate has come out and said, we're using, CrowdStrike. Okay, it's got to be able to work with that. Similarly, we got to be able to pull in threat detection tools. Some organizations are using a network tool like a Clarity or a Dragos or a Nozomi. Others are using a Microsoft or a Cisco. Remote access tools, Clarities or Dispel or whoever it happens to be. The point here is there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And so first point is think hard about the platform you're going to use to bring those pieces together. If you say, hey, it's not Verve, that's fine. Pick one though, because we don't believe you can do this in a scaled way if all of these things are independent tools that you're trying to use. Secondly, think about the services that you're going to need to support this. If you have different silos, each one of looking at a different part of this picture, you are going to have things fall through the cracks, waste energy, et cetera. So again, strong view is create a services team, whether that be internal, external, hybrid, that pulls all of these pieces together in one group so that you're seeing the full picture. I mentioned before, this all starts with that tech-enabled assessment. And this is where the services part becomes critical of having a joint and integrated group of people. Right. So the first piece is we got to decide what's the framework and what's our objective we're going to focus on. In many cases, IT has selected a framework or something, but that needs to be adjusted into OT. Right. So let's say we're doing the CIS top 18 and we're trying to hit level 4 or level 5 maturity of that. Well, there are going to be some elements of that that are technically not feasible on some devices in OT. I can't put an antivirus solution on a PLC. It just doesn't work. Okay, how do we then design a framework and the objectives specifically for OT? And that means you need people on that services team who can help with a deep understanding of the frameworks and OT. And not just take what's handed to them from the corporate team, which is a great starting point, and implement it because it will not work. So how do you then blend those two pieces? And that requires really a strategic perspective around frameworks and objectives. Then a team of people who can actually go in and do that technical assessment, who understand OT, who can put the technology into that environment safely to gather the needed data out of an OT environment and get down through the backplanes and get to every asset, et cetera, and then can model actual operational risk. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but we have to bring together the cyber risk, let's say, with the business risk. And that's, you can't just have a cyber person doing that. Those people actually have to understand the business part of things and say, okay, that plant is less valuable than that. How do we adjust the real risk levels? And then finally, phase 3 is building the roadmap. So what are the prioritized risks and how do we balance prioritization of different security measures that we're going to use and build essentially a sequenced roadmap out? And then I've mentioned this processes part a number of times here today, but governance, like who's in charge? How are we going to balance? How do we have a way of having a discussion that gets raised up around technical exceptions? But then also, how do we build processes to make this on a regular basis, right? How do we make sure that our patch process works in a certain way? How do we make sure that we're reviewing vulnerabilities in the same way every time? And so that tends to be the first phase of the journey is to get that very clear view. And by the way, that creates budget frameworks of how much we can spend, et cetera. And that assessment is going to cut across a range of areas. It's going to have policy and procedure elements. It's going to have networking elements. It's going to have access control topics, passwords and remote access, et cetera. And it's going to have endpoint discussions around patching and backups and software management. And so again, as we think about the team that needs to come together to do this, they need to be broad-based. They need to be understanding not just one part of security, but the whole picture. So you could put the puzzle pieces together to build yourself a robust, last point, roadmap, right? So the ability to say, I'm going to balance off a series of initiatives that are network related, that are access related, that are endpoint related, and eventually procedural, putting those pieces together into a sequence that's right for that particular organization requires a deep understanding of the OT environment. It requires an understanding of security and reliability, but also requires an understanding of business, right? Like what's feasible? How does that plant going to operate? What's going to be the cost? All those pieces have to come together in a way to build that robust roadmap. Again, another reason we believe in this integrated notion is the Mike Tyson point around, everybody's great until every plan's great until you get punched in the face. As you get into a plant, you have a wonderful plan and you get into that environment, and now I got to execute. I got to so I'm going to patch all these critical vulnerabilities. Well, maybe I'm not going to patch all those because I can't update that system. That's dependent on something else, et cetera. And so we start to move around the actual remediation. Passwords, great. We're going to go update the passwords. Well, that device, we have to have shared passwords for whatever set of reasons. Or I'm going to remove the dual NICs in this environment. Well, the Ovation system requires us to have dual NICs for the following sets of reasons. You need to have a team that not only is great at planning, but they can walk the floor, that can go into that environment and understand that particular control system and what you can and you cannot do. And in the moment decide, okay, how do we adjust that great roadmap to make it work practically in this particular environment? And that kind of remediation step, the practical part of remediation, not just having strategy, but having real world teams that can be on site that can help deal with the realities of that environment. And that's what we call think global, act local. And so the way we've had success doing managed services with our clients is to have this think global, act local approach. So start with think global. There's a number of elements of this that you need to scale. You need to get centralized. If we leave everything at a plant level, we literally it's impossible. There are not enough OT cyber people in the world to have each plant have its own security program. There has to be a way to pull that data out to a centralized place where a central team can analyze it, prioritize it, build playbooks, et cetera. And this tends to be thought of as a SOC, and certainly a SOC could be the place you do this. But this is an OT specific team that isn't just looking at log data or network intrusion data. It's looking at that entire security picture, and it's planning out what are the remediation steps I'm going to take on a regular basis to keep that risk down. But then when I actually go to execute, so now I'm going to actually patch this month, or I'm going to harden configs, or I'm going to respond to a threat. I have to have people, quote unquote, locally to do that. When we say local, we don't necessarily mean, at every site. It may be that, a site is not managed locally, right? It's a group of sites or something. It could be substations where there's not somebody there every day. The point, though, is someone who understands that local control system so that when we start to patch, for instance, they understand, what patches you can deploy when you can take an outage, if you need to take an outage, et cetera. And so when you think about a managed services team, having it be able to scale up and have a central team. So for instance, in our world, we have 16 centers around the world that can help manage OT environments, but then local, meaning we have people in every geography around the world to send to that site to help deal with updates or to help deal with an incident response or whatever it happens to be. So having a managed service team that can help you scale up, but also be local enough to deal with the complexities and realities at the front line, again, we think is key. So we're going to talk about a couple of examples of how this comes in practice. First one we're going to talk about is vulnerability remediation. So as I mentioned way back at the beginning of the presentation, the first challenge and the first goal is we got to know what we have. Can't do this if we don't have an asset inventory. So in our world, we use the Verve Security Center, which is a proactive tool that allows us to go deep into a network, does not rely on network traffic to try and estimate what assets are there. But we literally go down to each and every asset through backplanes, and we gather up what is each asset in the environment. That then allows us to take that information about software that's on those assets, et cetera, and map it to known vulnerabilities, map it to end-of-life assets, et cetera. And so that software, that technology gives us that running start, I'll call it, on vulnerability remediation. It also gives us a running start because it includes a risk score. that has a variety of elements in it, which we can talk about here in a minute. But that risk score is customizable, meaning each organization is going to likely have different scoring mechanisms or elements, or at least maybe not dimensions, but certainly different score levels for different assets. And so therefore, there's a services team who helps customize that score for that particular organization. Then we have to go to the compatibility analysis. Great. So we know there's vulnerability. We know there's a patch. Now we have to know, is it actually patchable given the rest of the assets that are surrounding it in that environment? And that's where the compatibility analysis comes in. So Verve is integrating the Rockwell product compatibility database into our software. But in addition, we have services teams who can help our clients figure out, all right, what's compatible with what? And to be able to lay out a patch program that's not just as simple as saying, yep, it's a vulnerability, so patch it. No. Here's the various pieces you'll also have to update that. And then finally, the whole act local part of this is to have field resources that can support the actual actioning of those remediations. So get on the floor and actually update those devices. In our view, that is how a managed service provider can really help an organization make practical improvements in their security, rather than, yeah, you've got a threat, or not even threat, you got an alert or an alarm that's gone off. Here you go, figure out what to do about it. Or, hey, we identified a vulnerability, figure out what to do about it. No. From the beginning to the end, right? You got a vulnerability and we've actually fixed it. And if we haven't fixed it, we know the compensating controls you need to put in place to do it. And what we can then do is monitor that and manage how are we doing on our risk score. So great, we put in a risk score. We were, red here. How are we doing? Are we actually improving? Not just how many alerts are we seeing, but is the risk reducing each and every day, week, month as we move forward? So now pivoting over to the other side of this picture a little bit, the data reliability. Justin's going to talk a little bit about his experiences of how does he improve a client's data reliability from going from 70% reliable to sort of that 5 nines. So Justin, I'll hand it over to you for a couple of minutes here.
Yeah, thanks, John. We're just going to take a few minutes here to discuss what he mentioned. Data reliability is obviously important to every organization. Without your data, without having it readily available all the time, it's not as valuable to you. So where we come in is we try to add through managed services a way to make your data more reliable, analyze what you have, and provide a better service for you guys so that you have your information that you can use. We constantly see challenges, as we've kind of talked about throughout this presentation, of resource limitations or having one person doing multiple hats. We see that a lot, especially with historians, where like an engineer at a site might be responsible for a system, but also maybe be responsible for support of a data historian and trying to keep that up and monitored, and they just are kind of overwhelmed in that respect. So we come in a lot of times and we kind of do the same philosophy as with the cyber security OT type setup, where we kind of identify what you guys have, your data sources that you're getting in your historian. We can use information from the customer on that, and then we leverage Verve a lot for that to see what systems are out there on your network, or what software versions do they have, things like that we can then kind of get a picture of what you guys have. So then we can set up a system either within the application itself or other third-party tools to actually monitor and detect issues automatically. So you're not relying on someone seeing a problem or waiting for a customer to say, hey, we're not having any data from the system out there, what's going on? And then you start kind of reactively troubleshooting. It's more of a proactive approach. And then when that alert goes out, letting users know, okay, what's having a problem? Is there any information we can gather? Is this device up? Is the data stale? Is it pingable, not pingable type of thing? You can include a lot of that package in the notification and send that to the correct people so that the response can be appropriate and timely. And then you can apply, like on the bottom here, your troubleshooting playbooks, other things like that, verifying that your data streams are back up. Various ways to do that, making sure your data is there so your customers have it for their reporting, for their, dashboarding, everything they want. And then at the very end, kind of documenting that in your various systems, ServiceNow or SharePoint, wherever you might have it, so that you know what happened, why it happened, and how to respond in the future, and then you can track that moving forward. And then with all of that, basically you can the reliability of the data is what you're after. This particular customer that we were a few years back, they didn't even have a way of measuring it. We came in kind of seeing where are we at. This is where they were at around 85%, which isn't the worst that we've seen, but it's not very good when you're 85% available. And then just applying the strategy, getting the playbook together, knowing what they have, and analyzing it in an automated way took them within a year to that 95% range, so about a 10% increase, which was pretty big just from a policy type of change. And then after that, we did more of like an analysis of their system, of their software, what they had out there, and then that took us to the 99. Like the 100's always the goal, but it took us to the 99% range where they want to be by making some changes to the environment, software updates type of thing. And then now that they have this program in place, they can make sure they maintain this, and then applying other things like we set up backups of their systems that were collecting this data. So now they have good backups so they can maintain this reliability moving forward. So all these pieces kind of do work together to make sure that you have a reliable system that can reliable data that you can provide for your customers.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate that. And we really believe that these pieces fit together because we have to secure the environment and we have to ensure that the IoT and other types of data is flowing where it needs to. And the two are integrally linked because it's all coming down to your networks, your devices, and their connectivity. And then the last example we want to talk about was that quote unquote SOC idea. So absolutely, we definitely understand the need for this SOC capability for our clients. And Rockwell has built a managed SOC capability before Verve joined them. And now what we can do is we've taken the integrating layer of Verve where we're bringing in syslog and NetFlow, configuration changes, metrics, packet inspection information, et cetera. And then that SOC can manage that from an alerting point of view, et cetera. I think the part that's most exciting about this is, again, we're not just leaving it as an alert team or alert and a notify team, but instead, because we have deep understanding of those environments, we know every asset in those environments, we then can create a recommendation of what we call the LDR, the least disruptive response that you can take to that threat. And so the OT SOC capability goes from being an alert and notify to being a alert, define the response required, and then possibly even taking a response action should that be appropriate. And so the ability to close that loop and have a managed services team that isn't just sitting there identifying, alerting, and notifying, but actually bringing you a recommendation resolution. And if you'd like to close that loop, drives significant costs out of the system and improves the security rapidly. And so as we come to a close here on the presentation, really that's been our goal and what we've been able to achieve with this approach to managed services, right? So with this approach on the assessment side, so a tech-enabled approach where we're using software rather than surveys, we're not having to go walk down every plant. we drive about a 50% savings in the overall cost, and importantly, take about half the time out too from a global assessment program across sites. And then from a remediation and maintenance point of view, because of this notion of think global, act local, meaning have a bunch of the activities coming up to a small centralized team, not have to have a person at every site that's trying to do cybersecurity, to be able to scale up your data analyses so you know where the reliability gaps are and focus. All of that drives about a 70% reduction in the cost of maintaining this kind of a program. Obviously, cost is important, but it's not important if we don't actually improve the security too. And so on the right-hand side is an example using the NIST framework that a client did where they measured where they were on NIST CSF before they embarked on this journey and where they were after, the blue and the gold. And so you can see that there's a significant improvement, roughly a doubling of their scores as they went through the journey that we're talking about. And so we don't only believe this approach works well, we've seen it work. And we've been able to post those results and actually help organizations achieve it. So whether or not you're going to use Verve to do this or somebody else, we think the principles remain. The principles of having an integrated team, of thinking across your journey, of thinking about when you get down to things like a SOC, making sure it's more than just an alerting place. When you think about security, not just stopping at that security piece, but thinking about, okay, how can I leverage that team to do reliability of things like data traffic, et cetera. We strongly think that really is the way you can drive down your costs and significantly improve the maturity in the same time. So with that, I'll turn to questions. To the extent anybody has a question, please do pop it in the Q&A. There were some that came in before our session today, so I'll start by addressing those. So first question was, what metrics do you use to quantify cyber risk? And so I mentioned earlier in our session here that we have a risk score that's built into Verve. And so that risk score is dependent on several dimensions. So first, obviously, is going to be the criticality of the asset itself, right? So is this a critical line? Is it a critical device on that line? Or maybe it has redundancy, so it's a little less critical, et cetera. The second will be things like vulnerabilities. So how vulnerable is that device to an attack? Does it have, 10 critical vulnerabilities on it? What are the CVSS scores of those? And how is that adjusted in the OT environment? Then what are the other controls I may already have on that asset? So do I already have an antivirus on that asset? Do I have whitelisting? And has whitelisting been really locked down? Do I have a backup for that device in case it got ransomed? So a variety of these different measures that we're looking at the risk of the asset and then the compensating controls of that asset. So we think about it kind of a three-dimensional piece. So A, the criticality of the asset, B, the vulnerability or risk, and then C, the compensating controls that I put into place. And those three things really drive our risk scores. Another question was, how do we define a modular and scalable services offering? So I think we've kind of hit on these points. We know that each function in this, so patch management or vulnerability management, that needs to be modularized. We need to be able to deliver on that. But the only way we can scale this is if we scale it from a think global, act local point of view, meaning get the stuff that you can do centrally and, by the way, integrated in one place, and then do the things that you have to do locally with a distributed team of local resources to do that. And so it's modular in a way that we do certainly have functions, but we really, 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 again, highlight the importance of being integrated as well. Because unfortunately in OT, if you just are doing one silo and you're not thinking about the other silos, you probably won't secure the environment. There'll be a lot of things you just can't get done. And then there's a question around what an ideal managed service relationship looks like. So I think it kind of goes back to this integrated point. As we think about designing organizations with our clients, so we'll go through this process. We'll do the assess, the remediate, the assessment and the road mapping. And in that road mapping, we're building the governance processes. We will lay out, as I showed you on that one page with the dot points, and by the way, we'll send this document out. Here's all the activities that are going to happen at different levels, whether it be centralized or locally or regional, whatever. We then lay out, here's all the tasks that are going to have to get done. And then by going through, okay, who's going to do which of those tasks, right? Is that going to be an internal team? Is that going to be an external team? And basically walking through the tasks and saying, okay, here's how we're going to divvy up this. And then, but building one team, one organized team that thinks across the operational organization and the managed service provider. You know, a regular rhythm of governance of weekly meetings or daily meetings, whatever it happens to be. And so we think that relationship being long-term, meaning going through the journey together, being integrated together as one team are the two key points of it. Rohit asks, what's the best approach that Verve takes to perform the OT assessment? So I'll answer this. I assume there's a couple of parts of approach, right? So the first part of approach is, what's the process that we use? So our process is we use a tech-enabled version of an assessment, meaning we use our software that we put into the OT environment to gather data directly from the assets. It's very quick. It doesn't take 90 days to gather the data because we're waiting for data to communicate, for devices to communicate with us. We go out and we pull the data directly back from those devices. And that means networking devices, PLCs, HMIs, et cetera. So we get a really rich picture of the risks in that environment. We'll then also interview, usually we do this, we almost do all of these remotely. We'll interview the staff about processes that they currently have in place. And then we typically review any policies or procedural documents that exist. And from that, we then build a roadmap, or first we build essentially a gap statement, and then we'll build a roadmap. The second part maybe of your question is, well, what standard do we use to do that? And what we've learned is that every organization has their own choice of that. And so we're certainly happy to use that client's approach if they've come up with one. If not, we tend to start with NIST CSF as the foundational element. And then we typically blend that with CIS 18. We find that the CIS is a great framework because it's very prescriptive. It doesn't just tell you, here's what you need to do, but it gives you literally scores and what good looks like. And that's a very helpful thing for many organizations so they don't get wrapped around the axle debating what good looks like. We'll certainly take into approaches IEC 62443, which many organizations are starting to adopt, particularly on network segmentation side of things. And obviously, if there's regulatory requirements. So we do a lot of work here in the US on NERC-CIP. We do a lot of work now in Europe as NIS2 starts to take hold. So those are kind of the two regulatory standards that we're seeing most frequently. So there's an approach of how, and then there's the question of, well, what standard are you assessing that against? Hopefully that's helpful in addressing that question. Well, again, we've come to the end of our time. I really appreciate everybody joining. We will be sending out the materials at the end of the day, and we look forward to welcome you to our next webinar. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone.